son of late martial arts star Bruce Lee has died. 27-year-old Brandon Lee was killed during a movie set accident today. He was filming a scene for the movie The Crow.
He was young, magnetic, and finally stepping out of a shadow that had haunted him since birth. Brandon Lee, son of martial arts legend Bruce Lee, had struggled his whole life to define himself apart from his father's towering image. He wanted to prove that he wasn't just the son of Bruce Lee, but an actor in his own right, talented, versatile, and capable of carrying a film on his own shoulders. In the early 1990s, that chance finally came in the form of a dark, gothic revenge film called The Crow. Brandon threw himself into the role with a passion that impressed everyone on set. At just 28 years old, he was about to cross the line from rising star to household name. But before he could enjoy his moment, tragedy struck. Just days away from finishing filming, during what should have been a simple scene, Brandon was fatally shot on set. What unfolded in the hours and days that followed shocked not only Hollywood but the entire world. There was confusion, grief, and disbelief. Whispers of cover-ups and sabotage swirled. Conspiracy theories bloomed, and some even dared to suggest a supernatural curse was at work. Why was there a real bullet inside a movie prop gun? Who was responsible for inspecting that weapon? And why were so many safety procedures ignored? To this day, Brandon Lee's death remains one of the most haunting tragedies in cinema history. It wasn't just the death of a young actor. It was the sudden silencing of a career that was just about to explode, a story forever entangled with the legacy of his father, and a chain of mistakes so glaring that many refused to believe it was mere coincidence. It all began with a scene that seemed so ordinary on paper, so routine that no one expected anything unusual from it. The sequence called for Brandon, playing Eric Draven, to return home carrying groceries, only to be ambushed by thugs. One of them, played by actor Michael Massey, was supposed to raise his revolver and fire. Brandon would collapse dramatically to the floor. The camera would capture it, the director would call cut, and they'd move on. It wasn't even a stunt scene. No explosions, no high falls, no dangerous fire gags. It was simple choreography. Everyone had rehearsed it. Everyone knew their part. Hollywood had been doing gunplay scenes for decades without incident. This was supposed to be one of the easy days on set. But when the cameras rolled that night, things unraveled in a way no one could have anticipated. Massey lifted the revolver, aimed it, and pulled the trigger. A shot rang out, loud, sudden, but familiar. To the crew, it was nothing unusual. They had heard dozens of bangs during production. Brandon dropped instantly to the ground, just as scripted. Massey stayed in character. The director called cut. Applause even rippled through the room. It seemed perfect, like they had nailed it on the first try. But then something felt wrong. Brandon wasn't moving. Not at all. At first, the crew thought maybe he was still acting, holding his position to give the scene extra realism. A few seconds passed. Someone called out his name. He didn't respond. Someone rushed forward, perhaps expecting him to laugh and break character, but when they rolled him over, the sight stopped them cold. Blood was soaking through his shirt. Not stage blood, not a special effect, but dark, pulsing blood from a real wound. Brandon had been shot. The set erupted into chaos. Paramedics were called immediately, and Brandon was rushed to New Hanover Regional Medical Center. For hours, surgeons worked frantically to stop the bleeding, but the damage was too severe. The bullet had ripped through vital organs, leaving devastation in its path. Despite desperate efforts, Brandon Lee was pronounced dead at 1:03 p.m. on March 31, 1993. He was 28 years old. The crew, still reeling from the shock, couldn't comprehend how this could have happened. Prop guns weren't supposed to kill. Blanks were supposed to create sound and flash, but no projectile. Yet something real had torn through Brandon's body. Michael Massey, the actor who had fired the shot, was shattered by the realization. He later described that night as the one that stole his innocence. He withdrew from acting for a long time, haunted by the role he had unwillingly played in his colleague's death. Friends and crew members would later say he never truly recovered from that moment. When the news broke, headlines captured the world's attention. Actor Brandon Lee slain on set, dies in freak accident. It was shocking enough on the surface, but behind the headlines was a torrent of questions. How could this possibly happen on a professional film set? Who was responsible for weapon safety that night? Why was the gun not inspected before the cameras rolled? And, most chillingly, what exactly was inside the chamber when Massey pulled the trigger? The initial reports were vague, even contradictory. Some speculated that a blank had misfired. Others suggested debris or a fragment had been lodged in the barrel. But the autopsy results destroyed those theories. A real .44 caliber slug was recovered from Brandon's body. Not a fragment, not a freak malfunction. A bullet, which meant that somehow, on a Hollywood film set, someone had placed a live round into a gun and aimed it directly at an actor. For many, that fact alone was too much to accept, and as investigators dug deeper, the story only grew darker. Even before Brandon collapsed that night, the production of The Crow had been plagued with misfortune. Crew members whispered about a curse almost from the beginning. Within just weeks of shooting, bizarre accidents piled up. A carpenter was horrifically burned after accidentally making contact with live wires. The same day, 2 more crew members were injured in separate mishaps. Equipment broke down without warning. Storms destroyed parts of the outdoor set. Lights failed. Props malfunctioned. At first, people joked about it. They called it the Curse of the Crow, in a half-laugh as if it were a running gag. But beneath the jokes was a growing unease. Seasoned professionals, men and women who had worked on dozens of sets, admitted that something about this production just felt wrong. The long, grueling work hours only made matters worse. Crew members were routinely clocking 18-hour days, sometimes working 90 to 100 hours a week. Exhaustion blurred judgment. Safety shortcuts became the norm. Corners were cut just to keep the schedule alive. By the time Brandon was preparing to film his last few scenes, everyone was running on fumes. Many believed the worst was behind them, that they had already survived the worst of the accidents. They couldn't have been more wrong. What made the atmosphere even heavier was the story they were telling. The Crow was about a man murdered alongside his fiancée, who returns from the grave to take revenge. The themes of death, resurrection, and vengeance hung over the set like a shadow. Brandon himself was playing a character who died violently, only to rise again. After his real death, the parallels were impossible to ignore. Life and art had become grotesquely entangled. Journalists covering the production described an unsettling, almost oppressive mood. Entertainment Weekly's Julianne Gary said, "Nothing ever seemed to go right." One crew member, speaking years later under anonymity, admitted, "People tried to say it was haunted. I don't know about that, but there were definitely bad vibes on set." After the tragedy, many wondered if fate had doomed the production from the beginning. Was it a curse, or just the result of human exhaustion and neglect? But when investigators turned their attention to the weapon itself, the answer they found was more chilling than any curse. The revolver used that night was a real Smith & Wesson .44 Magnum. In Hollywood, it isn't unusual to use real firearms for authenticity. Normally, they're loaded with blanks, rounds that produce the noise and flash without firing a projectile. Earlier in the production, the crew had shot a close-up involving that same revolver. For realism, the gun needed to appear loaded, so the props team used dummy rounds. These are supposed to be inert, no powder, no primer, just the appearance of a bullet. But the props team made a critical error. They removed the gunpowder from the cartridges but left the primers in. That primer contains a small explosive charge. During one of those close-up takes, a dummy round was dry-fired, and the primer had just enough force to push the bullet out of its casing and into the barrel. This created what's known as a squib load. A bullet was now stuck inside the barrel, but no one realized it. No one checked. No one cleared the weapon. Days later, when the gun was needed for Brandon's fatal scene, the dummy rounds were swapped out for blanks. Blanks contain gunpowder, but no bullet. Under normal circumstances, they're harmless beyond noise and flash. But when Massey pulled the trigger, the blank charge ignited, propelling the lodged bullet out of the barrel at full speed. In effect, it turned the revolver into a live weapon. The result was catastrophic. It was negligence, pure and simple. The dummy rounds had been improperly manufactured. The gun had not been checked between scenes. Most damning of all, there was no licensed weapons master on set that night. Instead, the responsibility had been left to a prop assistant. Overworked, exhausted, and unqualified to handle firearms. In almost any other industry, such negligence would be considered criminal. But in Hollywood, the official word was that it was just an accident. The investigation corroborated the sequence of mistakes that led to Brandon's death, but classified it as unintentional. Still, many, especially Brandon's family, believed it was more than an accident. It was criminal negligence. A single, overlooked safety check had ended a life, and no one would be held accountable. But the deeper investigators dug, the more disturbing the picture became. The Crow was not a massive studio blockbuster. It was a mid-budget action film trying to stretch every dollar. Every delay cost money. Every extra day of shooting pushed them closer to financial collapse. So the pressure was relentless. Safety protocols were loosened. Responsibilities that should have been handled by certified professionals were instead given to overworked crew. The licensed armorer wasn't even present the night Brandon was killed. The dummy rounds, the same ones that created the fatal squib, hadn't been purchased from professionals at all. They had been made in-house, cobbled together by the effects team. Corners were cut at every turn. Guns were handed off without the standard triple check by the armorer, assistant, director, and actor. The culture of safety had evaporated under the pressure of deadlines and exhaustion. Crew members later admitted that warnings were ignored, safety procedures were abandoned, and mistakes became routine. An anonymous member confessed, "If better managed, this would never have happened." The studio, of course, denied those claims. They insisted everything had been handled professionally. But privately, executives admitted the schedule had been brutal, and the crew was worn down. The tragedy wasn't just one mistake. It was a systematic failure. A series of rushed choices, overlooked warnings, and improvised fixes that culminated in a catastrophe. The illusion of Hollywood had failed, and reality had come crashing in. A real bullet had claimed a real life. Still, one aspect made the tragedy even more haunting. When news of Brandon's death broke, people couldn't help but see the eerie parallel. 20 years earlier, another Lee, his father, Bruce, had also died young, just as his career was reaching new heights. Bruce Lee had been 32, the biggest martial arts star in the world, when he died suddenly under mysterious circumstances. Officially, it was ruled a cerebral edema, swelling of the brain. But theories ran rampant. Drug interactions, foul play, even whispers of a curse. For years, speculation surrounded Bruce's death, and now, with Brandon gone in such a bizarre and violent way, the comparisons were impossible to ignore. Two men from the same family. Two promising careers cut short. Both deaths wrapped in confusion, controversy, and mystery. Both just on the cusp of superstardom. For some, it felt like a curse had truly descended on the Lee family. Brandon Lee's death wasn't just the loss of a young actor. It was the end of a legacy. A cruel repetition of history, and a reminder of how fragile life is, even in a world designed to manufacture illusions. His final film, The Crow, would go on to become a cult classic, partly because of the tragedy. That haunted it. In the end, Brandon became the very character he portrayed, A man who died young, immortalized forever in a story about resurrection and revenge. And while Hollywood moved on, the questions, the grief, and the eerie parallels never truly faded. And yet, the truth was that Hollywood had always been a place where appearances mattered more than safety, where budgets and deadlines often came before human lives. After Brandon's death, lawsuits were filed, settlements were reached, and quiet apologies were made behind closed doors. But to his family and those who loved him, no apology could undo what had been taken. His fiancée, Eliza Hutton, was left devastated, robbed of the life they had planned together. She stayed out of the spotlight, but those close to her knew she had been shattered in a way that would never fully heal. To lose the man she was about to marry, not to illness or accident, but to what appeared to be negligence, was a pain too, deep for words. The media swarmed her as they always do, hungry for quotes, for tears, for a story to sell. But she gave them nothing. She grieved in silence, holding on to memories that no camera could capture. Meanwhile, Hollywood moved on. The Crow was completed with a mix of body doubles and early digital effects, and when it was released, it became a cult classic. Audiences were struck by the irony of seeing Brandon play a man who returns from the dead to avenge his murder, knowing full well that in real life he would never return. The film's success was bittersweet. It immortalized him, but also served as a haunting reminder of the cost. Every frame was a ghost, every line a farewell. For some, watching it was almost unbearable. For others, it was a way of keeping him alive, if only for a couple of hours in the darkened glow of a movie theater. But the questions never stopped. Why was a real revolver used in the first place? Why was there even the possibility of a projectile being lodged inside the barrel? Why weren't stricter protocols in place? And why did it seem that after the incident, the industry was so quick to hush things up and move forward as if nothing had happened? To some, it looked like a tragic accident. To others, it looked like the latest chapter in a dark curse that seemed to follow the Lee family. Bruce Lee had died under mysterious circumstances at just 32, at the height of his fame. Now, his son had died at 28, in equally strange and tragic circumstances. The parallels were too eerie for some to dismiss. The whispers of a curse, of foul play, of something larger than coincidence, began to grow louder. The official reports told a simple story. A prop gun was mishandled, a blank cartridge was fired. Behind a lodged bullet fragment, and Brandon Lee was killed in a freak accident. But Hollywood insiders knew that film sets are filled with shortcuts, pressure, and sometimes carelessness. In the rush to save money and meet deadlines, corners are cut. Safety officers are ignored. Warnings go unheeded. It only takes one mistake, one lapse to turn fiction into reality. And in this case, that mistake had cost a man his life. Even decades later, people still wonder if there was more to the story. Could someone have swapped out the prop with a real round? Could negligence have been so extreme that it bordered on criminal? Was it all just a tragic accident? Or was it something darker? The Lee family's legacy seemed almost mythic, touched by brilliance but shadowed by tragedy. Bruce Lee had fought against stereotypes, carving out a place for Asian actors in Hollywood at a time when the industry refused to see them as leading men. Brandon was following in his footsteps, poised to break barriers in his own right. To lose both father and son so young felt less like coincidence and more like fate, the kind of story that makes people question whether destiny itself can be cruel. After Brandon's death, there were promises of reform. Hollywood swore it would never happen again. New safety protocols were discussed, more oversight was demanded, and actors began speaking out about the risks of working with weapons on set. Yet even with all of these lessons supposedly learned, history would prove otherwise. In 2021, nearly 30 years after Brandon's death, actor Alec Baldwin fired a live round on the set of Rust, killing cinematographer Helena Hutchins. Suddenly, Brandon's story was dragged back into the spotlight, a grim reminder that the lessons of the past had been forgotten. The same headlines appeared, the same questions were asked. How could this happen? Why weren't stricter rules in place? And why, in an industry worth billions, was safety still treated like an afterthought? For Brandon's loved ones, every new tragedy in Hollywood is like reopening an old wound. His mother, Linda, who had already lost her husband Bruce, had to bury her son too. No parent should ever have to endure that once, let alone twice in a lifetime. And yet, through all the pain, she remained composed, carrying the weight of her family's legacy with grace. She rarely spoke publicly about the so-called curse, dismissing it as superstition. To her, Bruce and Brandon were not myths, not symbols. They were flesh and blood, a husband and a son, and the world had taken both from her far too soon. In the end, the story of Brandon Lee is not just about Hollywood negligence or eerie coincidences. It's about the fragility of life, the arrogance of an industry that often plays God, and the grief left behind when dreams are cut short. His story is a warning, but it's also a tragedy that transcends film. When audiences watch The Crow, they are not just watching a performance. They are watching the final moments of a life that could have gone on to greatness, a promise, unfulfilled. And perhaps that is why the film continues to resonate. It is both art and obituary, both entertainment and evidence of how carelessness can destroy a life. And yet, despite the tragedy, Brandon Lee's story refuses to fade into silence. Fans keep his memory alive, not just because of how he died, but because of how he lived, with passion, with talent, and with the determination to carve his own path. The shadows of Hollywood may have taken him, but the light he left behind continues to shine. And maybe that is the final truth about Brandon Lee, that even in death, his presence endures, haunting the industry that failed him, and inspiring those who still believe that dreams are worth chasing, even when the cost is unimaginable. Even today, film schools and acting academies around the world use The Crow as a case study, not just in filmmaking techniques, but in the cautionary tale of what can go wrong when even one mistake is allowed to slip through the cracks. Directors remind their students that no shot, no scene, no performance is ever worth the price of a human life. Hollywood, for all its glamour, has left behind a trail of tragedies where safety was overlooked in the pursuit of perfection. But none cuts deeper than the story of Brandon Lee, a man whose fate seemed written in the stars, echoing the legacy of his father, and whose death became the very thing that transformed him into an immortal legend. For many, this realization is haunting, that Brandon, like Bruce, only achieved the immortality of icons by leaving the world far too soon. And yet, perhaps the most haunting thought is what could have been. Imagine, for a moment, an alternate history in which Brandon Lee finished The Crow without incident, went on to star in The Matrix, carved out a career as one of the most beloved actors of his generation, and lived to see his family grow old by his side. That is the dream fans still hold on to. His potential was limitless, his charisma undeniable, and his hunger to honor his family's name unmatched. He was on the brink of becoming more than just Bruce Lee's son. He was ready to be Brandon Lee, a legend in his own right. But fate had other plans, and that loss is something cinema will never recover from. Today, when people revisit The Crow, they don't just see a gothic action film. They see Brandon's final performance, a performance that is, in many ways, his gift to the world. His haunting words, his pain, his rage, his vulnerability, all of it bleeds through the screen, as if he knew he was leaving behind a message. It is a performance that transcends time, one that ensures his presence will never fade. In the darkness of the story, Brandon's light shines through, and maybe that is why the film continues to resonate with new generations. It feels alive with the soul of a man who gave everything to his art, even his life. And so, the legacy of Brandon Lee endures not just as a tragedy, but as a symbol. A symbol of passion, of fragility, of how thin the line is between dreams and disaster. His story reminds us of the cost of carelessness, of the responsibility that comes with art, and of the way legends are often born out of heartbreak. For Bruce and Brandon Lee, father and son, destiny seemed to demand sacrifice. But their spirits live on through every kick, every word, every frame of film they left behind. In the end, perhaps that is the true immortality. Not the years they lived, but the mark they made on the world. And though their time was brief, it was powerful enough to echo for eternity. And perhaps that is why, decades later, people still talk about Brandon Lee, not only as the young star who was lost too soon, but as a reminder of how fragile life truly is. Every fan who watches The Crow feels that mixture of awe and grief, caught between the brilliance of his performance and the sorrow of what it cost him. In that way, the film became more than entertainment. It became a memorial, a time capsule of talent and potential that the world never got to see fulfilled. Hollywood has tried to move on, as it always does, but the shadow of Brandon's death still lingers over every discussion of film safety and tragic on-set accidents. His name is brought up whenever new actors take dangerous roles, whenever studios weigh the risks of using real weapons or cutting corners on protection. His story is whispered as both a warning and a prayer, that no one else should ever have to suffer the same fate. And so, while Bruce Lee gave the world a philosophy of strength, movement, and discipline, Brandon Lee gave us something equally powerful, the reminder that legends can be both fragile and eternal. He may have been denied the long life and career he deserved, but in the end, his name became timeless. Brandon Lee is not forgotten. He is not just a footnote in Hollywood history. He is a symbol, a ghost that still walks among us, reminding the world that sometimes the brightest flames burn only for a moment, but their light lasts forever.